I remember asking one of my interns, how did you learn it? What did you get? How did you figure this out? And he wrote out The Clinical Physiology of Acid-Base and Electrolyte Disorders by Bud Rose. He said, get this book. This will teach you everything you need to know.
Welcome to the ASN podcast, bringing you a broad range of nephrology topics, including interviews with experts, discussions about cutting-edge advances in research and care, and insights about the federal government. You're listening to Convergence, a historical assessment of kidney diseases, nephrology, and health policy in the United States. ASN's newest podcast series explores how the evolution of kidney care and research influences the field of nephrology today.
Hello, and welcome to the new American Society of Nephrology podcast series, Convergence. My name is Andrew Cohen, and I am Professor Emeritus of Medicine at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University and a proud ASN member since 1976. While interviewing for my first nephrology position at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in 1979, I met the chief of nephrology at St. Vincent Hospital, one of UMass's teaching hospitals. Burton David Rose, or Bud as he preferred to call himself, was then a slender, intense young man who quickly told me he was working on the first edition of a textbook, Clinical Physiology of Acid-Base and Electrolyte Disorders. This would later become the text of enormous importance to medical students, fellows, and nephrologists. Bud and I became colleagues and friends, and he would later invite me to co-author a chapter in one of his later textbooks, Pathophysiology of Kidney Disease. While he might have rested his reputation on these concise and beautifully crafted texts, Bud's legacy goes far beyond these, with his subsequent invention of UpToDate, the online medical information resource used by physicians and healthcare providers all over the world. I'm privileged to be joined today by two nephrologists whose intimate knowledge of Bud and his work will help to illuminate our subject today, the smartest guy in the room, Bud Rose, and the invention of UpToDate. Dr. Robert M. Black is Professor Emeritus of Medicine at UMass Chan Medical School and former Chief of Nephrology at St. Vincent Hospital and Fallon Clinic, now Reliant Health. He is the author of numerous clinical studies and serves on several institutional review boards. Most importantly for our purposes, Bob was Bud Rose's close colleague at St. Vincent's Hospital and later succeeded him as chief. Dr. Joel Topf is the medical director of St. Clair Nephrology Research and an assistant clinical professor at both Wayne State and Oakland University's William Beaumont School of Medicine. He's the author of two medical textbooks, including the Fluid Electrolyte and Acid-Base Companion, and the editor of two others, Nephrology Secrets and the Handbook of Critical Care Nephrology. He blogs at Precious Bodily Fluids. He is the founder of Neph Madness, Nephrology Quiz, and NephJC, a Nephrology Journal Club. When doing all this, in addition to patient care, he can be found on Twitter X under the name Kidney Boy. So why don't we start with you, Bob? Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to know Bud Rose.
Thanks, Andy. In 1981, I had just completed my renal fellowship at Mass General Brigham. I took my first post-training position in Worcester, Mass., which is where I met Bud Rose. He was a chief of nephrology at St. Vincent Hospital and was widely read in a number of textbooks, including Pathophysiology of Renal Disease. When I met him, I could immediately see he was smart, organized, and an excellent teacher. He was able to simplify complex topics for both residents and medical students, and interestingly, there was always a long waiting list for his renal elective by the students at UMass. Interestingly, there was no internet available to the public at that time, and the ability to be current was a manual process. Bud had developed a filing system consisting of handwritten index cards. The cards were enormous in number and took up enough space to fill 4 large file cabinets in his office. He used this process for maintaining a bibliography in his book, as well as the other books he had written at that time. As a final thing, Bud and I, after we'd worked together for some time, he asked me to co-author a renal textbook titled Manual of Clinical Problems in Nephrology. This book wasn't published until 1988. 4 years earlier, Apple Computer released a computer called the Mac 512, and this computer had a built-in filing system with index cards and the ability to use hypertext to move from one topic to another.
That was called
When we-
HyperCard, right? That's
Yeah,
that was
maybe
the
that
old-
is.
It was
the
it was
original
called
HyperCard
it-
program, right?
exactly. It was called HyperCard. And when we published the book, Clinical Problems in Nephrology, we were able to use this computer-based filing system that made finding references not only easily available, but also very current. Some of the references cited were published only 2 months before Clinical Problems in Nephrology was released. I was looking at that in the book, and there's a reference in here on controlled plasma exchange trial in acute renal failure in multiple myeloma, published in 1988, which is the same year the book was published, something you couldn't do with just trying to keep up reading and reading. The passion for being sure the information was current was central to Bud Rose. I believe this is one of the primary drivers that offered a mechanism through which he could develop a unique renal textbook that could not only be saved on a computer, but also be updated frequently. And since then, he just seemed to be driven by keeping things current.
What was it like to be with Bud in those early years? What was it like to work with him, to see him in conferences, to know about this filing system? My recollection is that he had this uncanny command of the medical literature on virtually any subject that we talked at during our case conferences, which we held weekly and rotated among the 3 different teaching hospitals. When Bud was responsible for one of those conferences, he knew everything about the subject and could expound on it spontaneously. What was your experience like?
I think it was very similar to what you're saying. I learned a lot from him. He was incredibly intense in trying to keep up with everything. He read voraciously and had the ability, though, to take very complex subjects, or at least though it seemed very complex, and make them fairly simple. The residents, medical students, and other physicians would just flock to see him give a talk or ask him questions.
And that
So it
was
was really-
reflected, pardon for the interruption, that was reflected in the clarity and conciseness of his writing, which is one of the reasons why his textbooks became as popular as they did. They were easy to read. Some of them were quite long and involved, but they were easy to read and easy to understand. And I think that's a gift that many of us did not possess, particularly at that time.
I agree with you completely.
Well, I think one of the other amazing things is that you think about all of the medical textbooks, how few of them are single author textbooks, right? And as an editor of a textbook, like the current book we're working on has 80 chapters. And as you can imagine, there's a standard deviation in terms of quality of chapters from each one of those different authors, right?
Right.
And that's part of your job as an editor, is to wrangle the worst ones up to at least average, right? That's the best you can hope for. And Bud Rose not only is one of the best medical writers, just beautiful prose comes out of his pen, but he writes every single chapter. And it's a work of love to have that kind of quality steady throughout the whole book. Amazing.
So we're talking about particularly the clinical physiology of acid base and electrolytes, the book that he authored by himself. This practice of his to keep this large file system, first on paper and later using HyperCard, wasn't that unusual at the time, right, Bob? I mean, the 2 of us here are real old timers, myself and Bob. I remember many of my colleagues in academic medicine keeping files of important articles that they wanted to refer to later on, whether it was for teaching or research. That was not an unusual practice, but Bud brought it to a whole different level. Isn't that the case?
I think he did. And I think it did allow you to cross-reference things fairly easy. So if there was a topic such as hyponatremia, and you wanted to look something up that you actually knew you had looked at before, it could be done simply on a computer, which couldn't be done as easily. It was a lot more work intensive to try and do it with just note cards. So I do think he did that very, very well. And I think he was committed to doing this type stuff. I think he really didn't accept anything that wasn't first class, I don't think.
Interesting. In the early generations of UpToDate, I don't know when they stopped doing it, each topic was actually called a card, like kind of harking back to that original
the
filing
3x5, the 3x5 cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Joel, tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection with Bud Rose.
So I know Bud Rose like the vast majority of people know Bud Rose just through his works. So when I was a third year medical student, I did my first internal medicine rotation at the VA, and I was completely baffled by fluid and electrolytes. We would order a basic metabolic panel on every patient every day, and I would look at it and I would have no idea how to respond to that. And then patients would be getting IV fluids, and there's a whole, a half a dozen different choices of different IV fluids to give, and I had no clue on how to do that. It really felt like a fundamental skill of an internist. I remember asking one of my interns, how did you learn it? What did you get? How did you figure this out? And he wrote out Fluid and Electrolyte, or the Clinical Physiology of Acid-Base and Electrolyte Disorders by Bud Rose. He said, get this book. This will teach you everything you need to know. And I was super enthusiastic, like, oh, this is going to be able to this is going to solve my problem. I go to the bookstore and it's a 700-page book. And I was like, what is he doing to me? Who does he think I am? But I bought the book and it sat on my shelf. I didn't even crack it during my third year. But during my fourth year, I picked that book up and I started to read it and was blown away because the clarity was amazing. And then there's another book he had called Renal Pathophysiology that he wrote with Helmut Reinke that was also brilliant. That same clear prose that Bud Rose is so famous for, but just kind of going over all the glomerular pathology and glomerular diseases that you need to know as a medical student and a resident as a fellow, of course. And I was in awe of this guy's skill. I was actually an early adopter. So I bought UpToDate during my internship year when it was still being delivered on CD-ROMs, when it was not yet complete. He hadn't finished all of internal medicine. It was still for sale.
It was mostly then for nephrology, correct?
But it also had cardiology and endocrine, but they hadn't finished infectious diseases, right? There was a lot of holes in it. But he said, hey, every quarter it's going to get bigger. And I'm going to update. Not only is it going to get bigger, but it's going to get deeper. Things that I've already covered will get updated. Things that I'll cover will get filled in, and I'm going to add additional specialties. And I, immediately saw there was a few things about it that were completely different from any other text. For example, you can read the entire chapter on community-acquired pneumonia in Harrison's and finish the chapter and still not know how to treat anybody, right? One of the things that every card in UpToDate had is at the end of the card they said, this is how I would treat this problem. And that was such a difference, right? He forced the authors to lay out and say, this is what you do, which you don't see in a lot of other textbooks. And it made a huge difference in terms of how I'm going to do it. And then the other thing that he clearly did was he knew that he was on, one of the features of UpToDate, again, it was not internet connected, it was on CD-ROMs, but one of the CD-ROMs just had a PubMed database of abstracts. And you could pull up a reference and boom, it not only would tell you the reference, but it would give you the abstract. And you could see where the evidence came for all the recommendations, which just all of a sudden, it made me understand, oh, this is how knowledge is built, right? It's not just given to us by the gods, on high, is that scientists are building this knowledge. These are the experiments they're doing to prove it. That was also part of his style, right? Part of the physiology of acid base is all about, how do we know this? Well, let me tell you how we know this. This is the experiment we did. We did this in dogs. We did this in people. We did this in medical students, right? And it was completely different than the contemporary literature of the time. I think it has become the style that you see a lot of literature written. I know that I have adopted that style in terms of the way that I talk about and teach, is that this is how we do it now, is that, I'm just following the example of the best teacher I ever had, which was Bud Rose.
Did you ever meet him? He was, he often was at the ASN meetings, hawking his UpToDate at a booth, and so he, met many members of the ASN and others who came by and chatted with him very, very informally. So you did have the occasion to.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I met him. He would always do the quiz section on fluids and electrolytes at the ASN. That was kind of there'd be a number of panelists, but everybody was there to see Bud Rose. And he would have an amazing case. And then, and so you'd see him and you'd be in awe of what he just taught you. You're like, oh my God, that's amazing.
Right.
And then you'd go into the vendor section and there would be UpToDate. This was before they sold. And I think it was him and his wife that were running this company. And he would be at that booth and he would be talking about it. And he would be the nicest guy and such a believer in his own product. It was amazing.
So it's fair to say that even before there was UpToDate, we'd probably still be talking about Bud Rose who I should mention, by the way, passed away 5 years ago after developing, in an ironic twist, a cruel ironic twist, developing dementia and then succumbing to COVID-19. But his legacy lives on, and it's fair to say that even before there was UpToDate, people would still be referring to his textbooks. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think, yeah.
So what about UpToDate? I mean, what is it about UpToDate, and why is this so widely used? And what has it done for medical education? What do you think about that, Joel or Bob?
That's a tough question. I think, remember when it started out, it was just nephrology. And I think when he started it, I don't think he had planned at that time to go into other specialties. Then instead of waiting to put them all together to get it one large textbook, he just did them as they came out. So his way of doing this was really never, I don't think it's anything that's been done before.
He
If I
did this
look at,
by himself, right? In his home with the
he
help
did it
of
by
his wife.
himself with his home, with his family. They would mail out floppy disks from their, Gloria's wife says it was from their house, but it was actually from their garage. And they do this every 3 to 4 months, so people would get updated. Then
Remarkable.
floppy disks became CDs, and they mailed those out. And then I think it was in 1994, because I think UpToDate was published in 1992. In 1994, the internet was released to the public. And at that point, it changed things enormously because they could do it much easier. And it was available to many, many more people. I think if I look at the way Bud did things, having read Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs, I almost think of Bud looking at things that way, where he never seemed interested in UpToDate for the money. He seemed laser focused on making it the best thing available.
You're not
And
the
he
first
hired,
person. You're not the first person, by the way, Bob, to make that comparison. In
Mhm.
one of the obituaries, the one written by the folks at Beth Israel Deaconess,
Mhm.
they compared him. They called him the Steve Jobs of
Mhm.
medicine.
Mhm.
And I think it's fair to say that a guy who had written these state-of-the-art textbooks had now done something that really would, in some ways, replace textbooks. Is that fair to say?
Oh,
I think you're
absolutely.
right.
Oh, he created the information resource for the information appliance of the day. For books ruled the world, from Osler's first textbook on medicine through Harrison's. And you would think that Harrison's would not be dethroned, but they were not native to the new information appliance, which was the personal computer. And being native to the personal computer. I remember seeing, I would get my Harrison's and it would come with a CD-ROM, and it was a miserable experience to try to read Harrison's on a CD-ROM because all they were doing is they were porting the old technology to the new technology. It's like when you first had movies and all they would do is they would film a stage play and not understanding, oh, it actually have a new medium and there's all these new possibilities. And the UpToDate, first of all, it was updated 4 times a year before it was on the internet. And then once it was on the internet, it was updated continuously. It had deep references with abstracts. It had tons of pictures, right?
It was truly interactive.
It used the resources of this new medium, which is the computer.
Mhm.
It was amazing. And then full text search, which was so much better than an index, is unbelievable, right? And the most important one is, when you go to write a new edition of Harrison's, you first go to the marketing department and say, well, how much can we charge for it? And they say $400. Take that $400, then you go to the production department. You're like, well, how many pages can we get from $400? And then they tell you, okay, this can be an 1,800 page book. And then you got to divvy up those 1,800 pages among all your different chapters, right? And if you're going to add a whole section on HIV, because I started medical school in 1991, and Harrison's now has an HIV section, there was some other part of the book that had to get pulled out to be able to put that whole new chapter in,
Mhm.
right? UpToDate has none of those concerns, no limits. We'll just add, okay, we're going to add HIV in, and we're going to go deep on HIV. We don't need to remove anything.
Right. Or COVID-19 when the pandemic struck. So now that we have extolled the virtues of UpToDate, the fact that it's so universally used as a resource among physicians, among medical students, among residents, among fellows, has become part of the movement toward, as you call it, Joel, this new medium, which involves people sitting in front of screens. I'm asking the question, I think it's fair to ask, is there any downside to this? Was there any advantage to the old-fashioned way where you would actually go to a library or go to PubMed and look up references for a particular subject that you were investigating and do the research for yourself as opposed to having it all there in front of you with UpToDate? Do you have any concerns about that, or should we have any concerns about that?
Maybe I could answer that to some extent. It's very reliable, understandable, and it's very current. But as Joel had mentioned, there are different authors. And some, most are very, very good. Some are better than others. So some chapters may be more reliable than others. One of the concerns that I have with medical students has been when they frequently, if you ask them a question about what they want to do on a patient, they frequently begin the defense of the diagnostic or treatment plan with UpToDate says.
Aha.
So they go to one place and they're not used to going anywhere else or critically looking at that. What do you think?
How about you, Joel?
No, I mean, first of all, that's a great argument for a medical student. It really is hard to counter with UpToDate says, because 99 out of 100 times, that's going to be the most reasoned, most studied, most correct answer. I mean, they get the author. You look at the authors, any topic that you're familiar with, where you really know that topic really well, and then you go and take a look at who's writing the section of UpToDate, you're going to recognize the name, and you're going to know that they're a person who is well versed and knowledgeable about the topic. They don't get yahoos to write these sections. They get great people to do it. And the style is designed to, I think it shows the limits of knowledge, right? Because it's very evidence-based. They will outline, hey, we do this because of this study, and we do this because of this study. And they will talk about the weaknesses of the evidence. And then at the end, of course, they have to make a recommendation, because right at the end of the day, even if we don't have perfect knowledge, we still need to treat the patients. And I think all of that is surfaced well in UpToDate. And like you can draw up lines of logic where like, well, it'd be better if people worked harder to get the information or they did their own research. I feel like, yeah, there may be some advantages to that, but given the time crunch that most people are in and the level of knowledge or sophistication that they would take to doing this research, probably better off going with UpToDate. Net, it is a big win, and there may be some downsides that you guys did outline. And I think one of the downsides is there is some ossification, that when you only look at people that are the experts in the field, they may be less likely to reject newer theories, less likely to look at newer data because they are invested in ways things have been for a long period of time. That may cause some ossification, it may slow some progression, some new thoughts from getting there. But overall, I think it's a clean win.
I would remind everybody that Joel is the purveyor of the Nephrology Journal Club, NEFJC, which encourages people to read, the latest literature on things. So it's not necessarily a mutually exclusive set of properties here, correct?
100%. No, I mean, to be up to date and contemporary nephrologist, you need to be reading the literature. I think UpToDate catches up very, very quickly, but honestly, it's fun, right? It's what makes it's why nephrology has become so much more interesting in the last 10 years. Is we're getting new, highly compelling data. Some of it's very surprising. Some of it you wouldn't have been able to figure out just from the physiology, which is been super fun. I'm thinking about the SGLT2 inhibitors. I'm looking at the MRAs. We're looking at the GLP-1 receptor agonists. Like, this is revolutionizing nephrology, and it's happened in the peak of my career. And what a time to have an online journal club, to have all these articles coming out. It's been an amazing dividend.
One of the things that I've thought about, I don't know what you think about this, Joel or Andy. Do you think that nephrology fellows, for instance, today, have any idea that UpToDate was started as nephrology?
Well, that's the perfect segue to my next set of questions. The title of this podcast is The Smartest Guy in the Room, not to exclude women, of course, but this title was lifted from a book called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, which went into the whole scandal of Enron. The implication is, nephrologists are often considered, quote unquote, very smart. I'm sure that you, Bob, and Joel, and most of us have heard from other physicians in particular, or people in medical school, oh, wow, you're a nephrologist, you must be very smart. Um, does that mean that, was it a coincidence that UpToDate was developed by a nephrologist, or was there some destiny there? What do you think?
I would think that I would think that in part it's I suppose destiny in the sense that nephrologists tend to be in part the math. When kids are in college, they're doing calculus. When they become doctors, they can't do arithmetic. And I think that the fact that we use a lot of numbers and seem to savor seeing patients with complex medical conditions probably encourages people to, or at least lets people think or know that we're fairly intelligent. So it's a unique group of people. I'm not sure we're better than other people, but we clearly are not afraid of seeing patients from other systems. Whereas I think in certain specialties, if it's anything outside the specialty they're seeing, it's a referral. So maybe that's one thing.
So
What do you think?
one of the things that certainly got me interested in nephrology, I was first and foremost interested in internal medicine. And nephrology seemed to be a way of maintaining my grasp of internal medicine because it was by nature so generalized. In order to be a good clinical nephrologist, you needed to know the whole of physiology, whether it was cardiovascular physiology or endocrinology. But not just that, you needed to know about infectious diseases if you were taking care of transplant patients and immunology. So it was really the entire landscape of medicine that a nephrologist needed to possess. And it's for that reason, I think, that people often think of us as being very good clinicians. What about you, Joel? What's your thought about this?
So, I think we have a hard time arguing that we're the smartest guys in the room. There's a lot of smart people in medicine. They're distributed widely over a bunch of different specialties. I do think that nephrology is a topic that is intimidating to lots of people. Kidney's considered a black box, and I think that partly is because we do a poor job of teaching it in medical school. People find it confusing in their second year of medical school, don't want to be more aggressive with it, or are happy to just consult a nephrologist and not engage in that. So, but I do think that nephrology we are natural teachers because of what you were saying about how fundamental nephrology is and some of the topics that we engage in terms of fluids and electrolytes that touch on every specialty, and that we have an important role in teaching all of internal medicine. People that are just going to be general internists are going to be dealing with hypokalemia and hyponatremia their entire lives. And it's not especially things, routine electrolyte disorders like hypokalemia, routine diseases like hypertension that fall under the purview of nephrology. We're going to be the people that are to be chosen or have an opportunity to be teaching those residents. And I think it's a great match, right? And so I do think it's kind of not surprising that UpToDate, which is one of the great educational endeavors of our time, was pursued by a nephrologist. We do have a specialty that roams over all of internal medicine and can touch a lot of those different areas. I think you see this in teaching faculty around the country, is that you'll find nephrologists being part of the teaching faculty of an internal medicine residency program over and over again.
I think, it would be helpful to try to reignite some of the old passion that many of us felt for nephrology as being this kind of comprehensive specialty, which now embraces all these other problems in medicine, as we said, cardiovascular disease, endocrine disease. Think of all the diabetics we take care of, but also taking care of patients over the long haul, establishing continuity of care, even caring for patients at the end of life, which is something we don't discuss very often, but is part of a nephrologist's practice. I have a perspective that's now online and in press at the American Journal of Kidney Disease called "Is Dialysis Nephrology's Original Sin?" And I think it gets into the very question about whether or not dialysis has become too dominant. Is our practice of nephrology too dialysis centric? And are there things that we can do to add greater balance to the nature of our practice? Any of you have thoughts about that, either of you?
I mean, I would agree with you. I think it's become a little dominant. And I think, but of course, that's based on, to some extent, some people really like doing it. And other times it has to do with finances. So I do think that if in some way those finances could be distributed throughout the group, which would include transplants, et cetera, I think it might be helpful. But that gets back to money again. And I think Joel is right that getting called in on Saturday night because somebody's potassium is 5.7 and going home and being exhausted the next day is probably not going to draw people. They need to figure out a way to do that. Having level providers do it is different because somebody's got to be covering for them. I mean, you can't just send people in there who don't have coverage. That's something that would be good if addressed.
Right. Well, of course, part of the problem is the physician payment system, which provides a much higher reimbursement for dialysis than, for example, seeing a patient in the office. That needs to be reordered, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Well, any
Right.
other?
It's
Go
hard
ahead, Joel.
it's hard for me to unwind. I feel like nephrologists are really addicted to dialysis and the reimbursement that it offers. And to try to think about unwinding that boggles my mind. It is so important to the structure of our practice, right? If we didn't have the income from medical directorships and the income and and MCP payments for seeing dialysis patients, the whole practice would be turned on its head. And so I am not creative enough to kind of see what nephrology looks like without that. I grew up in it. So I started my practice in 2003, and we were deep into dialysis already by then.
That was not always the case. In my early days as a nephrologist, dialysis was just getting underway. Do you have any last thoughts about Bud and his impact on the practice of medicine? Anybody?
I mean, it's interesting. If you look at St. Vincent Hospital, which is where he was, if you talk to the house staff there, they actually don't know who Bud Rose was. They know UpToDate.
Wow.
So I think that happens. But they know it once I tell them they know it, and then it spreads a little, but they really don't realize he was there. The other thing I'd say about Bud is, as you said before, he did this because he had a vision. And I don't think he ever did it for money, although he made money with it.
Any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm putting together this podcast called Channel Your Enthusiasm. And we are going through Burton Rose's Clinical Physiology of Acid-Base and Electrolyte Disorders, chapter by chapter. I've got a great group of renal clinicians and renal educators that we discuss each chapter with. It's amazing because the breadth. We got Melanie Honig, who's a friend of Bud, who's on the podcast. Yeah, and then we have another people, at least when we started the podcast, were fellows who had never read the book before. And all of us have just fallen in love with it, and another opportunity to read the prose. And it's interesting because the last edition of the book is the 5th edition, and it's getting close to 25 years old now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of the book, which is kind of, the science has moved on and gone past it, but there's enough of it that is there. And some of the most interesting parts are, you can see in Bud's prose him saying, yeah, I think we're going to learn about this. And these are the pieces of data that are bothering me. Then we're able to fill in those gaps with 25 years of additional data and say, yeah, he was onto the right thing. He was pulling the right thread. He just didn't have the data yet. And the respect that I have for him, he's almost prescient in some of the areas where he was like, this is going to change. It's really interesting.
He was very exacting. He was very demanding of others, but mostly of himself. And he wrote and constantly rewrote this textbook. That was really part of his gift and his endurance as a teacher.
Yeah, amazing stuff.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you, our guests, Robert Black and Joel Topf, for this discussion, which I found enlightening and a lot of fun. And I'd also like to thank Catherine Buckler, our producer for the ASN podcast series. Thank you, Catherine. and look forward to our next podcast in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Andy.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or another qualified healthcare professional. If you have any questions about any medical conditions or before or taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast by the American Society of Nephrology. I'm Todd Ibrahim, Executive Vice President of ASN. If you're a nephrologist, fellow, or kidney health professional looking to advance your career, stay informed, and build connections, I encourage you to become an ASN member. Membership, which is free to fellows and other trainees, offers exclusive access to groundbreaking research through our journals, discounts to live and virtual educational programs, including Kidney Week, and support of a global network of nearly 22,000 kidney professionals. To learn more or join ASN, visit www.asn-online.org. Thank you.